In the early years of the Cold War, when Berlin stood as a divided city at the fault line between two ideological systems and intelligence collection was waged as intensely beneath the streets as across diplomatic tables, the Central Intelligence Agency and Britain's Secret Intelligence Service embarked on one of the most ambitious technical espionage operations of the era, a clandestine engineering project that would become known as Operation Gold to the Americans and Operation Stopwatch to the British, involving the excavation of a tunnel from the American sector of West Berlin into the Soviet-controlled zone to tap high-capacity underground communication cables used by the Red Army and Soviet administrative authorities. Conceived in 1953 and executed in 1954 and 1955, the project required extraordinary logistical coordination, careful deception, and technical sophistication. Yet, it unfolded under a profound and hidden constraint, because from the earliest planning stages, the KGB had been informed of the operation through a British intelligence officer named George Blake, who had secretly committed himself to the Soviet cause and passed detailed information to Moscow Center long before the first shovel penetrated Berlin soil. The origins of the tunnel can be traced to the broader strategic environment of post-war Berlin, where the four-power occupation framework had hardened into a geopolitical confrontation, and signals intelligence emerged as a critical tool for understanding Soviet military intentions in Central Europe. Western analysts sought reliable insight into Red Army order of battle, troop movements, logistics planning, and political directives transmitted across the Eastern Bloc's command network, and the discovery that major Soviet communication cables ran beneath the city presented an opportunity of rare operational promise. The CIA's Berlin base, supported by the Army Security Agency and British counterparts, developed a plan to access these landlines by constructing a concealed tunnel extending from a warehouse in the American sector to a junction point in the Soviet zone, a distance of roughly 450 meters, requiring precise surveying, silent excavation techniques, reinforced structural supports, and climate control systems to prevent condensation from damaging sensitive recording equipment. The engineering challenge was immense, as the tunnel had to remain undetected by Soviet patrols, East German workers, and routine construction activities, while also accommodating the installation of tapping devices capable of intercepting thousands of communications daily without disrupting signal flow. Construction commenced in August 1954 under cover of a radar research facility, with excavation conducted around the clock using specialized equipment designed to minimize noise and vibration, and the spoil was discreetly removed and concealed within the warehouse structure to avoid raising suspicion. By early 1955, the tunnel reached the target cables, and technicians installed sophisticated induction taps that allowed Western analysts to capture vast quantities of voice conversations and teletype transmissions, generating a stream of intelligence considered highly valuable for assessing Soviet military posture, including details of troop rotations, logistical supply issues, and political commentary within the East German regime. For nearly 11 months, the tunnel operated continuously, feeding reams of intercepted material to analysis centers in Berlin, London, and Washington, where linguists and military experts parsed the content for indicators of strategic intent. And early reports suggested that the operation was yielding significant insight into Warsaw Pact planning, during a period marked by the consolidation of NATO and the formal establishment of the Warsaw Pact itself in 1955. Yet the extraordinary audacity of the tunnel project was matched by an extraordinary irony, because the KGB had been forewarned by George Blake, a British SIS officer stationed in Berlin, who, after being captured during the Korean War and exposed to communist ideology while imprisoned, had volunteered to serve Soviet intelligence upon his release. Blake's access to Anglo-American operational planning enabled him to provide detailed briefings to his Soviet handlers regarding the proposed tunnel, including its route, construction methods, and intended purpose. Faced with this knowledge, the Soviet leadership confronted a strategic dilemma. Exposing the tunnel immediately would protect communication security, but risk revealing the existence of a valuable source within British intelligence, while allowing the operation to proceed would enable the protection of Blake's identity at the cost of some intelligence compromise. The KGB ultimately chose to permit the tunnel to function, calculating that preserving Blake's position within Western intelligence offered greater long-term strategic benefit than denying the intercepted communications, and they implemented countermeasures to limit sensitive traffic across the tapped lines, carefully managing the flow of information so that critical secrets were withheld while routine or less sensitive communications continued, thereby sustaining the illusion of operational success on the Western side. In April 1956, after nearly a year of operation, East German authorities staged the dramatic discovery of the tunnel during what was presented as routine maintenance work, inviting journalists to witness the exposure of Western espionage and condemning the operation as a violation of sovereignty, while Western officials protested that similar surveillance activities were routine across the divided city. The public unmasking generated diplomatic friction, but did not reveal the deeper truth that the Soviets had known from the outset, and Blake's role remained concealed for years, allowing him to continue transmitting secrets until his arrest in 1961 following revelations from a Polish defector. Operation Gold thus stands as a case study in Cold War espionage, where technical ingenuity intersected with human betrayal, where the CIA and SIS executed one of the most ambitious tunneling projects in intelligence history, and where the KGB's strategic decision to protect a single mole reshaped the value and impact of the entire enterprise, illustrating the layered complexity of intelligence warfare in Berlin during the 1950s and the extraordinary interplay between engineering audacity and clandestine compromise that defined the era's shadow conflict. The conceptual foundations of Operation Gold emerged from a period in which signals intelligence had become central to Western strategic assessment of Soviet capabilities, particularly after the Berlin blockade of 1948 to 1949, and the formalization of NATO in 1949, events that hardened Berlin into a frontline intelligence arena where proximity offered rare opportunities for interception. By the early 1950s, U.S. and British analysts understood that the Soviet High Command relied heavily on landline communications linking military headquarters in East Berlin with Moscow and forward units stationed throughout East Germany, and reconnaissance efforts had identified key cable junctions running beneath the city, creating the possibility that a carefully engineered underground approach could bypass surface surveillance. The idea drew partly on earlier British experience in Vienna, where a more limited tapping operation had achieved measurable success, and CIA officers in Berlin, led by William King Harvey, pushed for an expanded project that would deliver high-volume access to Soviet and East German communications traffic. The proposed tunnel would originate in a nondescript warehouse in the American sector near the border of Treptow. Constructed under the guise of a radar research facility operated by the U.S. Army Signal Corps, an excavation would proceed beneath a major road into the Soviet zone at a depth of approximately 6 meters, requiring reinforced timber and steel supports to prevent collapse in Berlin's sandy soil and waterlogged substrata. Engineers faced constant technical constraints, including groundwater seepage that threatened equipment integrity and the necessity of precise alignment to intercept a cable bundle carrying multiple trunk lines without triggering signal disruption detectable by Soviet technicians. The project mobilized a discrete workforce of cleared personnel operating in shifts around the clock, using muffled pneumatic tools and specialized ventilation systems to maintain airflow while minimizing acoustic signature. By February 1955, after months of careful progress, the tunnel reached the target junction, and installation teams affixed tapping devices capable of inductively capturing both voice and teleprinter transmissions across thousands of circuits. Recording equipment housed within the warehouse converted signals into magnetic tape, generating an unprecedented volume of raw intelligence that was shipped daily for transcription and analysis. Early assessments characterized the take as substantial, including Red Army logistics updates, discussions of training exercises, and internal East German security reports, which analysts believed provided insight into force readiness and doctrinal priorities during a period of heightened tension over German rearmament and the integration of West Germany into NATO structures. Unbeknownst to the operational team, however, the KGB's awareness of the tunnel from inception shaped the strategic environment in subtle but decisive ways. George Blake, assigned to SIS's Berlin station after his repatriation from North Korean captivity, had already established secure channels with Soviet handlers, providing detailed briefings that included the projected tunnel route, construction timeline, and intended tapping points. The intelligence value of Blake to Moscow extended beyond Operation Gold, encompassing broader Western planning and asset identities, and the KGB therefore confronted a critical calculation. Prematurely exposing the tunnel would compromise Blake's credibility and potentially expose him as a source, whereas allowing the operation to run would preserve access to a continuing stream of Western secrets. Soviet leadership opted for strategic patience, instructing communications authorities to route sensitive discussions away from the compromised cables, while maintaining routine traffic to avoid arousing suspicion. This decision reflects a hierarchy of intelligence priorities, in which a high-level mole within an adversary's service outweighed the damage inflicted by limited communications interception. Consequently, while Western analysts derived useful operational detail from the intercepted material, the most guarded strategic deliberations were withheld, and certain misleading or non-critical conversations were permitted to pass through the tapped lines, reinforcing the perception of success. The tunnel thus functioned within a paradox, a technically remarkable achievement, producing genuine intelligence, yet constrained by adversarial foreknowledge that subtly shaped the informational yield. On April 21, 1956, East German workers, acting on instructions aligned with Moscow's timeline for controlled exposure, announced the discovery of the tunnel during cable maintenance operations, and Soviet authorities orchestrated a media spectacle that portrayed the excavation as blatant Western aggression against socialist sovereignty. Journalists were escorted to view the subterranean passage, complete with recording apparatus and maps, and the episode was leveraged for propaganda value amid ongoing diplomatic tensions. Western governments acknowledged the operation with restrained protest, framing it within the broader context of mutual espionage activities that characterized divided Berlin. The public narrative presented the tunnel as a daring but compromised intelligence venture. Only years later, following Blake's arrest in 1961 and his subsequent confession, did the deeper betrayal become known, revealing that the operation had been penetrated from inception. Blake's conviction and lengthy prison sentence, followed by his dramatic escape to East Berlin in 1966, underscored the enduring human dimension of Cold War espionage, where individual ideological commitment could reshape strategic outcomes. Operation Gold therefore occupies a distinctive place in intelligence history as both a triumph of engineering audacity and a case study in counterintelligence vulnerability. It demonstrated the capacity of Western services to execute complex subterranean operations under hostile surveillance. Yet it also illustrated how a single compromised officer could recalibrate the balance of advantage. The KGB's decision to allow the tunnel to function, sacrificing some communication security to protect Blake's access, reveals a strategic calculus prioritizing long-term penetration over short-term damage control. In the layered contest of Berlin's intelligence war, success and failure intertwined. The CIA and SIS obtained valuable, though filtered intelligence, while the Soviets preserved a mole whose reporting influenced Western assessments for years. The tunnel's existence, exposure, and retrospective reinterpretation encapsulate the paradox of Cold War espionage, where technical brilliance coexisted with human frailty, and where the shadow struggle beneath Berlin's streets mirrored the larger confrontation dividing Europe. The strategic value Western analysts believed they were extracting from Operation Gold must be understood within the broader intelligence architecture of the mid-1950s, when signals intelligence was one of the few reliable means of penetrating the opaque structure of Soviet military planning in Central Europe. The Préfeurs, sources inside the Red Army, were scarce and often tightly compartmentalized. Aerial reconnaissance over East Germany was politically sensitive and technologically limited prior to the advent of high-altitude U-2 flights, and defectors provided episodic rather than continuous insight. The tunnel, by contrast, promised sustained access to command-level communications flowing between Soviet headquarters in East Berlin, forward units stationed throughout East Germany, and relay nodes linked back to Moscow. Analysts at the Army Security Agency and CIA stations processed thousands of recorded conversations and teleprinter intercepts daily, translating Russian and German traffic into summaries that were forwarded to Washington and London. Among the material captured were routine discussions of supply shortages, transportation scheduling, training exercises, officer assignments, and internal administrative disputes, all of which contributed to a mosaic picture of Soviet operational readiness and logistical posture. Even filtered traffic carried intelligence value. Patterns of communication frequency, tone, and bureaucratic friction could indicate morale levels, maintenance issues, and command discipline within Red Army formations deployed along the inter-German frontier. Yet because the KGB had foreknowledge of the tunnel's existence, the intelligence stream was inherently curated. Soviet counterintelligence officers quietly redirected highly sensitive communications to alternate circuits or face-to-face briefings, preserving critical secrets while allowing enough routine traffic to continue across the compromised lines to sustain the operation's credibility. This selective management underscores a sophisticated understanding of adversarial expectations. Had the lines fallen abruptly silent or displayed obvious manipulation, Western technicians might have suspected compromise. Instead, the steady flow of usable but incomplete material reinforced confidence in the tunnel's success. The CIA and SIS evaluated the take as substantial, and internal reports during 1955 described the operation as one of the most productive technical penetrations achieved in Berlin to date. The illusion of operational advantage thus persisted for nearly a year, shaping Western assessments of Soviet capabilities during a formative period that included the formal creation of the Warsaw Pact in May 1955 and West Germany's accession to NATO. The public exposure of the tunnel in April 1956 unfolded with calculated theatricality. East German authorities announced that cable maintenance crews had uncovered a clandestine western passage beneath the border, and Soviet officials denounced the operation as an egregious violation of sovereignty. Carefully staged tours of the site allowed journalists to photograph the reinforced corridor and recording apparatus, transforming a covert intelligence project into a propaganda spectacle. Western governments responded with restrained acknowledgement, noting that espionage activity was reciprocal in a divided city where both sides engaged in surveillance and counter-surveillance. The diplomatic fallout proved limited, in part because espionage had become an accepted, though officially condemned feature of Cold War competition. What remained concealed, however, was the internal Soviet decision-making that had allowed the tunnel to operate undisturbed until the chosen moment of exposure. That decision revolved around George Blake. As an SIS officer with access to sensitive operational planning, Blake provided Moscow with not only details of the tunnel, but insight into broader Anglo-American intelligence methods. His ideological commitment, formed during captivity in North Korea where he embraced Marxist convictions, made him one of the most damaging penetrations in British intelligence history. By safeguarding Blake's position, the KGB preserved a conduit of high-grade intelligence far exceeding the effluidity, tactical inconvenience posed by the tunnel's taps. When Blake was finally exposed in 1961, after information supplied by a Polish defector, the magnitude of his betrayal became clear. His arrest and subsequent 42-year prison sentence reflected the severity of the damage assessed by British authorities, though his dramatic escape from Wormwood Scrubs in 1966 and flight to East Berlin further dramatized the saga. Operation Gold thus reveals multiple layers of Cold War espionage dynamics. At the engineering level, it stands as a testament to Western technical ingenuity, demonstrating the capacity to execute a 450-meter subterranean project under hostile conditions without detection for nearly a year. At the counterintelligence level, it underscores how a single insider can invert the strategic balance of an entire operation. At the strategic level, it illustrates the calculus of deception and patience employed by Soviet intelligence, willing to accept limited compromise to preserve a more valuable asset. The tunnel's intelligence yield was real yet constrained, productive yet shaped by adversarial management. In the end, both sides extracted advantage. The West gained operational insight into routine Soviet activity, and the KGB protected a mole whose reporting influenced Western understanding of intelligence priorities for years. The Berlin Tunnel episode encapsulates the paradox of Cold War espionage, where technical triumph and human vulnerability intertwined, and where beneath the divided city's surface, the silent contest between services mirrored the broader geopolitical struggle above ground. The broader intelligence implications of Operation Gold extended far beyond the physical tunnel itself, reshaping how Western services evaluated the balance between technical collection and counterintelligence security in the volatile environment of divided Berlin. At the time of its construction, the tunnel was celebrated within classified channels as a demonstration of Anglo-American cooperation and engineering prowess, a tangible manifestation of the alliance's resolve to penetrate Soviet secrecy at a moment when Europe's political architecture was hardening into two armed blocs. Yet the later revelation that George Blake had betrayed the project before excavation began forced a reassessment of assumptions regarding operational compartmentalization and source protection. The planning for the tunnel had been tightly restricted to cleared personnel within the CIA, the U.S. Army Security Agency, and Britain's SIS. And yet Blake's position within the Berlin station granted him access to enough strategic context to reconstruct the project for his Soviet handlers. His betrayal demonstrated that technical brilliance could not compensate for vulnerabilities in human security, and it underscored the enduring truth that intelligence operations are ultimately bounded by the reliability of those entrusted with sensitive information. Within Moscow Center, the decision to permit the tunnel to proceed reflected a disciplined long-term approach to espionage tradecraft. Rather than reacting impulsively to exposure risk, the KGB evaluated relative value, concluding that Blake's continuing access to Western plans outweighed the intelligence loss incurred through limited communications compromise. Soviet communications officers were instructed to adjust protocols subtly, routing highly sensitive directives through alternative channels, relying more heavily on courier systems or secure circuits not encompassed by the tunnel's taps, while leaving enough routine traffic intact to preserve the deception. This calibrated management required coordination across multiple bureaucratic layers, illustrating the organizational sophistication of Soviet counterintelligence. The calculated exposure of the tunnel in April 1956 was timed to maximize propaganda benefit while minimizing operational damage, and the public denunciation allowed the Soviet bloc to portray the West as aggressors engaged in subversive surveillance, even as Moscow privately acknowledged that it had tolerated the operation for strategic reasons. The intelligence harvested during the tunnel's operational period, though incomplete, nonetheless contributed to Western assessments during a critical juncture. Analysts believed they gained clearer insight into Red Army logistics, command discipline, and readiness levels in East Germany at a time when West Germany's rearmament and integration into NATO had heightened tensions. The data, even if filtered, provided pattern analysis opportunities that would have been otherwise unavailable. Yet in retrospect, intelligence historians debate the true net value of the operation, weighing the insights obtained against the strategic advantage Moscow retained through Blake's continued espionage. His reporting extended beyond the tunnel, encompassing NATO planning assumptions, counterintelligence, priorities, and technical collection strategies, potentially enabling the Soviets to shape their own defensive posture accordingly. In that sense, the tunnel's story becomes inseparable from the broader narrative of penetration and counterpenetration that defined Berlin's intelligence war. When Blake was exposed in 1961 following information provided by Polish defector Michael Goleniewski, the British intelligence community confronted one of its most damaging internal compromises. Blake's trial and 42-year sentence reflected the gravity of the breach, yet his subsequent escape to East Berlin in 1966, facilitated by sympathizers and executed with remarkable audacity, further dramatized the episode. From his refugee in the Soviet bloc, Blake would later describe his ideological conversion and justify his actions as a moral stance against Western policy, though critics argued that his betrayal endangered lives and undermined democratic institutions. His case reinforced the necessity of rigorous vetting and compartmentalization within intelligence services, shaping reforms in counterintelligence procedures during the 1960s. Operation Gold remains emblematic of Cold War Berlin's subterranean contest, where geography, engineering, ideology, and human loyalty intersected in a single project. The tunnel's construction required extraordinary secrecy and technical adaptation to Berlin's sandy soil and groundwater, while its operation depended on precision electronic interception. Yet the entire enterprise unfolded under the shadow of a hidden betrayal that transformed its strategic impact. The KGB's willingness to let the tunnel run underscores a counterintuitive principle of espionage. Sometimes the greatest advantage lies not in stopping an adversary's operation, but in allowing it to continue under controlled conditions to protect a more valuable asset. In this layered exchange, each side claimed partial success. The CIA and SIS demonstrated capability and extracted actionable intelligence. The Soviets preserved a mole whose access reshaped Western security. The Berlin Tunnel thus stands as a study in duality, engineering triumph and counterintelligence defeat coexisting within the same narrative, illustrating how, in the Cold War's shadow war, audacity and betrayal were often inseparable threads in the fabric of strategic competition. By the time Operation Gold was exposed in April 1956, Berlin had already become the most concentrated arena of intelligence confrontation in the Cold War, a city divided not only by occupation sectors, but by overlapping layers of espionage, surveillance, informant networks, and technical collection platforms. And the tunnel episode must be understood within this dense ecosystem where every major power maintained forward-deployed intelligence capabilities in close physical proximity to adversaries. West Berlin, geographically isolated within East German territory, yet politically aligned with the Western Alliance, functioned as a listening post into the Soviet bloc, hosting CIA field stations, British SIS officers, U.S. Army Security Agency units, and a steady stream of defectors and couriers moving across sector boundaries. East Berlin, by contrast, served as a hub for the KGB, the East German Ministry for State Security, and other Warsaw Pact services coordinating counterintelligence operations and surveillance against Western installations. In this environment, technical penetration of fixed communications infrastructure offered a rare opportunity to bypass human intermediaries and access direct command traffic. The tunnel's designers understood that landline communications remained central to Soviet military coordination in East Germany, particularly for Red Army units stationed along the inter-German frontier. And tapping these cables promised insight into order of battle data, logistics flows, and internal assessments of Western military posture. However, the Berlin intelligence environment was characterized by constant counterintelligence pressure. Soviet and East German services routinely monitored Western activity near sector borders, conducted physical and electronic surveillance, and placed informants within local labor and construction networks. The fact that the tunnel was not discovered prematurely demonstrates the degree of operational discipline exercised by the CIA and SIS engineering teams, who worked under strict noise abatement protocols, concealed spoil removal within warehouse structures, and implemented ventilation systems designed to avoid surface disturbance. Yet this technical success masked the deeper vulnerability introduced by George Blake's betrayal. His reporting to the KGB meant that Moscow possessed advanced knowledge not only of the tunnel's intended trajectory, but also of Western analytic priorities. The Soviets could therefore assess which categories of communication were likely to be of highest interest and adjust traffic patterns accordingly. In effect, the tunnel became a controlled channel, producing intelligence that was genuine but strategically bounded. The exposure of the tunnel, staged as an accidental discovery by East German maintenance crews, was calibrated for maximum political effect. Soviet officials publicly condemned the project as an act of espionage violating occupation agreements, while Western authorities responded with muted acknowledgement, noting the reciprocal nature of intelligence activity in Berlin. The episode reinforced the city's symbolic status as a front line of covert conflict, yet it did not produce direct military escalation. Instead, it entered the historical record as a dramatic example of technical ingenuity, later complicated by revelations of counterintelligence compromise. When Blake's role came to light in 1961, it reframed the narrative entirely. The tunnel, once celebrated as an operational triumph, became a cautionary tale about insider penetration. Intelligence services in both the United States and Britain intensified vetting procedures, expanded background investigations, and refined compartmentalization practices in response to the recognition that a single ideologically motivated officer could undermine multi-million-dollar operations. From the Soviet perspective, the decision to allow the tunnel to function reflected strategic patience, characteristic of KGB doctrine. Protecting Blake preserved a channel into Western planning circles that yielded insights far exceeding the tactical value of compromised communications. The KGB's calculation underscores a principle central to espionage: the relative valuation of assets. A mole embedded within an adversary's intelligence service offers longitudinal advantage, influencing not only a single operation, but an array of future initiatives. Sacrificing some communication security to maintain such an asset represented, in Moscow's judgment, an acceptable cost. This calculus illustrates the layered logic of Cold War intelligence warfare, where short-term exposure could be tolerated to secure long-term strategic penetration. Operation Gold therefore stands at the intersection of engineering ambition and human frailty. Its physical dimensions, approximately 450 meters in length, reinforced against collapse, equipped with induction taps and recording arrays, testify to Western technical capability. Its operational lifespan, nearly 11 months of uninterrupted interception, demonstrates disciplined execution. Yet its ultimate strategic significance was shaped by an invisible variable: the ideological conversion of George Blake and his sustained reporting to Soviet handlers. The Berlin Tunnel episode encapsulates the paradox of Cold War espionage in microcosm. It was at once a feat of clandestine construction and a compromised endeavor, a source of intelligence and a vector of deception, a triumph in execution and a vulnerability in design. The shadowed corridors beneath a divided city, the subterranean struggle mirrored the broader superpower contest above ground, where audacity was met with counter-audacity, and where the most decisive battles were often fought not with armies, but with secrets. The long-term strategic consequences of Operation Gold extend beyond its immediate intelligence yield and public exposure, shaping how both Western and Soviet services evaluated the balance between technical collection and counterintelligence protection in the evolving Cold War environment. By the late 1950s, signals intelligence had become increasingly central to superpower competition, yet the Berlin Tunnel underscored that technical access, no matter how sophisticated, remained vulnerable to human penetration. The CIA and SIS had successfully executed a complex subterranean operation under hostile conditions, yet a single compromised officer neutralized much of its strategic advantage. This recognition reinforced a structural shift within Western services toward more rigorous compartmentalization, polygraph screening, and internal surveillance designed to detect ideological defection before operational damage could accumulate. The Blake affair became a case study in insider threat, prompting reforms that would echo through intelligence training programs for decades. For the Soviets, the episode validated a doctrine of calculated exposure. Rather than reactively sealing compromised lines and exposing the tunnel immediately, the KGB allowed the operation to proceed under managed conditions, extracting advantage by preserving Blake's position within British intelligence. This decision reflected confidence in their ability to control the informational environment selectively rerouting sensitive directives while permitting routine communications to continue. The measured tolerance of compromise illustrates a strategic hierarchy in which protecting a high-level mole outweighed short-term communications loss. It also demonstrates how intelligence services evaluate risk not in absolute terms, but relative to asset value and long-term penetration potential. The tunnel's public unmasking in 1956 was timed to coincide with a diplomatic moment advantageous for propaganda, reinforcing the Soviet narrative of Western subversion while concealing the deeper counterintelligence success. Berlin itself continued to function as the epicenter of clandestine rivalry. In the years following the tunnel's exposure, both sides intensified technical and human collection efforts, and the construction of the Berlin Wall in 1961 further transformed the operational landscape, limiting physical access but increasing reliance on electronic interception and agent networks. The memory of Operation Gold lingered within intelligence circles as both inspiration and warning. Inspiration for its audacity and technical execution, warning for the vulnerability introduced by compromised insiders. As technology advanced, including the deployment of high-altitude reconnaissance aircraft and satellite surveillance, the emphasis on underground engineering operations diminished, yet the fundamental lesson persisted: that technical superiority cannot compensate for deficiencies in counterintelligence discipline. George Blake's trajectory after exposure added a final layer of complexity to the story. His 42-year sentence, at the time the longest ever imposed in Britain, symbolized the gravity of his betrayal. Yet his escape in 1966 and resettlement in the Soviet Union transformed him into a figure of Cold War mythology. To Moscow, he was a valuable ideological convert who had struck a blow against Western intelligence. To London and Washington, he embodied the dangers of ideological penetration within democratic institutions. His case reinforced the notion that the Cold War's most consequential battlegrounds were often psychological and ideological, rather than purely operational. Operation Gold endures as a paradoxical episode, a daring technical success undermined from within, an intelligence bonanza shaped by adversarial manipulation, a propaganda victory for the Soviets that masked deeper strategic calculations. It illustrates how Cold War espionage was rarely linear, and how apparent triumphs could conceal hidden compromises. Beneath Berlin's divided surface, the tunnel represented the physical manifestation of a broader subterranean struggle, one defined by deception, patience, and the constant interplay between innovation and betrayal. In the calculus of intelligence warfare, both sides emerged with lessons rather than decisive victory, and those lessons would inform the conduct of espionage for the remainder of the Cold War, where engineering audacity and human vulnerability remained inseparable elements of the shadow conflict. Operation Gold ultimately occupies a distinctive place in Cold War history, not because it decisively altered the strategic balance in Europe, but because it exposed the layered complexity of intelligence competition at a moment when Berlin stood as the most compressed frontier of superpower rivalry. The tunnel was conceived in an atmosphere of urgency, as Western planners sought concrete insight into Soviet military posture in Central Europe during a period of rapid alliance consolidation, German rearmament, and Warsaw Pact formation. It represented a belief that technological ingenuity could compensate for the opacity of the Soviet system, that underground engineering and electronic interception could penetrate the veil of secrecy surrounding Red Army communications. In physical terms, the project succeeded. The excavation was completed without surface detection. The cable taps functioned as designed, and thousands of conversations were recorded, translated, and analyzed over nearly 11 months. The operation demonstrated logistical coordination, disciplined secrecy among construction crews, and advanced signal processing for its time. Yet the broader strategic narrative was shaped by a factor entirely detached from engineering: the ideological decision of George Blake to serve Soviet intelligence. Blake's betrayal reframed the tunnel not as a unilateral penetration, but as a controlled contest in which the adversary possessed foreknowledge from inception. The KGB's response, allowing the tunnel to operate while safeguarding their mole, revealed an intelligence doctrine rooted in long-term asset preservation over immediate tactical reaction. By managing communications flow and shielding sensitive directives, Moscow minimized damage while preserving access to Western operational thinking through Blake's reporting. When the tunnel was exposed in 1956, the public spectacle served propaganda purposes, but the deeper strategic outcome had already been secured. The Soviet Union retained its embedded source within British intelligence for years after the tunnel ceased operation. In that sense, Operation Gold underscores a recurring principle of Cold War espionage. Technical brilliance cannot override the strategic consequences of human compromise. The episode also contributed to institutional evolution within Western intelligence communities. The recognition that compartmentalization had failed to contain Blake's access prompted reforms in vetting, internal security, and inter-service information sharing. Intelligence organizations increasingly acknowledged that insider threat posed as significant a risk as external surveillance, and counterintelligence became an elevated priority in subsequent decades. Conversely, the Soviets drew reinforcement from their success in balancing controlled exposure with asset protection, refining practices that emphasized patience and deception over dramatic countermeasures. As Berlin moved toward the construction of the wall in 1961, and the intelligence battleground shifted toward satellite reconnaissance and electronic surveillance at global scale, the tunnel receded into history, yet its symbolic resonance endured. It represented the audacity of Cold War engineering and the vulnerability of intelligence enterprises to ideological fracture. Beneath the divided city, Western services carved a passage toward Soviet communications, believing they had secured an unprecedented window into adversarial planning. Above ground, the geopolitical confrontation continued uninterrupted. In retrospect, the tunnel was neither pure triumph nor pure failure. It was an episode defined by duality, where operational success coexisted with strategic compromise. The subterranean corridor beneath Berlin thus stands as a physical metaphor for the Cold War itself, an unseen struggle conducted in darkness, shaped as much by human conviction and betrayal as by machinery and steel, and resolved not through decisive revelation, but through layered ambiguity that reflects the enduring complexities of intelligence warfare in the 20th century